Funding for Texas Monthly Talks is provided in part by Public Strategies Incorporated, managing campaigns for corporations around the clock, around the world. And J.P. Morgan Chase, the state's largest financial institution, serving large and small businesses, governments, schools, churches, and individual Texans just like you for more than 135 years. And the MFI Foundation, improving the quality of life within our community. And the Matson McHale Foundation, in support of public television. And also by the Alice Clayburgh Reynolds Foundation, proud to be a founding partner of Texas Monthly Talks. And viewers like you. Thank you.
I'm Evan Smith, the editor of Texas Monthly. One might be tempted at a time like this to say something about going to the mattresses, or keeping friends close and enemies closer, or making offers that can't be refused, about how the next half hour isn't personal, it's business. One might even be tempted to do a bad impression of Brando as Don Corleone, but as much as that might be a lifelong dream of some people, it would be too easy, too obvious. And anyway, it might get this week's guest, Francis Ford Coppola, a little hot and bothered. For as he's quick to say, and no doubt even quicker to think to himself, there's more to his career than those 3 Godfather movies, however exquisitely executed they were, and culturally transformational they remain a generation later. True enough, while 68-year-old Coppola hasn't exactly been prolific of late, his most recent film, Youth Without Youth, shot in Romania and starring, among others, the great British actor Tim Roth, is his first in a decade. He is, of course, a 5-time Academy Award winner, with extraordinary and extraordinarily diverse notches in his belt as a writer, director, and producer. The selective, subjective high points of his filmography include Patton, The Conversation, Apocalypse Now, The Outsiders, The Cotton Club, and Tucker. He is also, as he would equally quickly point out, more than a mere filmmaker. He's a vintner of some repute, the publisher of a 10-year-old literary magazine, Zoetrope All Story, and maybe most impressive and interesting of all, a peerless family man. The undisputed leader of a dynastic clan that includes his sister, the actress Talia Shire, his daughter, the director Sofia Coppola, and his nephews, the actors Nicolas Cage and Jason Schwartzman. A more iconic figure Hollywood has rarely known. Surely he is one of the few genuine legends to grace our little show with his presence. A conversation with Francis Ford Coppola on this edition of Texas Monthly Talks. Essentially do a version of that. This will be a fun night. Okay. I got the call. It's on the one. It's on PBS. Lewis. And then I stopped my show to get back to it, but it's okay. Can I run this? Okay, everybody please take your seats. All right, good. Mr. Coppola, welcome.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you here.
My pleasure.
Let's talk about why you're in Austin and Texas. You have a documentary that you're going to show students on this campus, UT's campus, tonight.
Right. I made a film recently, this last couple of years, which represents really the first film I've made in 10 years. And I made it in Romania, based on a Romanian author, Mircea Eliade, a great philosopher and author. And my wife, who made the documentary while I was making Apocalypse Now, came and rather than making your kind of making of movie, where everyone is interviewed, the photographer and what have you, to examine it more from the perspective as what happened to that crazy guy whom you all saw in Hearts of Darkness, what happened 30 years later when he made another film, and that's sort of the tone of it.
Not everybody enjoys talking about their work, but this seems to be something you're excited about doing.
Well, I tend to function better when people ask me questions, and so I'm really not going to talk about my work. The film, it's a little eccentric, I think, this film, and shows a side of me, certainly as a 68-year-old, I'm now 68, just a few weeks ago, year-old man, and I think it's curious that I hadn't made a film for 10 years, and why, and what's different about this aspect of a new film career in a way, And so after the film was shown, the idea was that I would answer questions from the audience.
Right. Well, okay, so tell us, why didn't you make a movie for 10 years? What happened?
Well, primarily I reached the point where I thought this was now the time for me to really make work that was my own work. And of course, I had been so associated with big productions and ambitious productions that I did plan one and worked very hard on it, and actually ultimately, could never really pull it off. It was set in New York. It was a big film, Megalopolis, sounds like a big film, and right while we were shooting the second unit for it was the tragedy of the Twin Towers, and it really, so I tried to write my way out of that, because a film about utopia, or the aspiration for utopia, right when there was such a devastating tragedy and the beginning of more decades of war, really I couldn't quite figure out how to get out of the pickle I was in. And I describe that film as being in love with a woman who ultimately doesn't want you. And when you're in love with a woman who doesn't want you, not only do you not have her, of course, but you don't have anyone else, because you only can think of her. And that's how it was with Megalopolis. I just tried and tried. And also, Megalopolis was going to be quite an expensive film. So even if I could make it half as expensively as anybody else could, it still was going to cost, $80 million. And I figured, well, how am I ever going to pull that off with an unusual project that's, studios tend to be like little kids. They want to hear the same story over. Tell me the story of the three little pigs. Tell me the story.
Over and over.
Yeah, so that's what the movie business has become now. And so I just, was stuck, literally stuck. And I think I took inspiration. I mean, there's a story how I finally got out of that pickle, but I did take partly in inspiration from my daughter, Sophia, who went off and made Lost in Translation just on her own, more modest budget. And,
Right.
and in fact, we helped finance that picture. And I thought, well, maybe I should break this stalemate and find some personal subject matter or somehow get going again. And ultimately, and we could talk about it if you like, it's in the documentary. Ultimately, I found a little crack in the door. And
it's a very modest film, right? Very modest.
No, not really.
In cost?
Well, I mean,
it's no Megalopolis.
Right, I financed it myself, so for me it was gigantic, but it was,
But for the rest of us, how would the rest of us see it?
Well, it's in excess of $14-15 million, so it's not a little teeny $2.5 million film as Lost in, but it's a big epic in a way, even though it's made on a more modest basis than Megalopolis might have been.
And you're also getting ready to start a film Matt Dillon's going to star in.
A new film,
right?
in Buenos Aires. That in fact, that's one of the reasons I'm on this trip, because I told my company and everyone, look, I'll give you May, I'll give you all my time in May. I'll do anything you want, but then come July, I want to go to Buenos Aires and start a new film.
And shoot this movie. Right. So I guess from the outside, not knowing the Megalopolis story, you kind of wonder, well, did he decide that Hollywood was no longer capable of producing good work, and maybe he made a decision actively to distance himself from Hollywood, but not the case?
I wouldn't say good work. I think the whole communications, entertainment, motion picture, cinema is in such a transition that the big companies see that the money that they need to make is more in films like Spider-Man, which of course was opened very successfully, and the whole season really is going to rest on the shoulders of Spider-Man and the Pirates of the Caribbean and Shrek. And I understand they won't even finance a drama anymore, so that would mean films like The Best Years of Our Lives, or On the Waterfront, or
Godfather.
From Here to Eternity, or Godfather would be called a gangster thriller, so that might slip by.
Might be different.
So, but definitely the big companies are no longer interested in anything other than these types of what they call tentpole pictures, or that they can make a number of. And even the little independent company, which is a bright spot in our country, certainly for the young filmmakers, even they have been sort of bought up by the big companies, and so even they are very, money-making oriented for the smaller films. So it's a tough time right now to want to make personal film, what we call personal films.
Right. Well, we think about the era of the first two Godfather movies in the conversation. Have we created a myth about that period that's completely out of proportion with reality? Was it as great and as creative and interesting as we all believe it was?
I think it was a point in which the big studios came to the conclusion that they didn't know the kinds of films to make. You know, we had gone through big films like The Sound of Music had sort of tapered off, and they made other films in that design, and they weren't quite working, and so they were sort of, they were all ears as to what these younger filmmakers wanted to do, and I think there were some inspirational breakthroughs. I think Bonnie and Clyde was one, which at first was received very negatively, and the studios didn't, the studio finance didn't even care for it, and then people started to respond to some, you know, Midnight Cowboy, I would think. So there began to be some interest in a more unusual type of film. But it was somewhat accidental, and it was primarily because I think we all talked a good game, and they didn't know what to do next. And maybe something like that might happen again, because, you know, if the big bet on Shrek and those kinds of films doesn't just go on for years and years, there's going to come a point where they're not going to know what to do next, and some persuasive filmmakers will get in there and maybe get a chance to.
But right now, a movie like Bonnie and Clyde or a movie like Midnight Cowboy probably would have a much harder time getting made. Well,
at those budgets, because the independent film business is just a different set of economics, and it's very hard to get, I mean, even what those movies cost, and they were considered more modest, I would think it would be very tough to get those going.
In going back and rereading about that period, I was reminded that you were not that interested in doing the first Godfather movie when.
No, not at all. We had moved to San Francisco. We had a company called American Zoetrope, and had all these colleagues, George Lucas and Carol Ballard and John Milius and many others, and we wanted to make, as always, personal films. And a personal film, I mean, you know what it is. We were inspired to think that way from the wonderful European films that we were seeing in the late 50s and the 60s, you know. And we wanted to do that, films that you write out of your life or feeling, and are made for the sort of, you know, in the way novels had been before, or great plays, that whenever a playwright or a novelist was coming out with a new work, you were just so excited. What would it be? You know, have no idea what it would be, and it was like a breakthrough. And today, in this era of more marketing, even within publishing, there's less of that. I mean, maybe we wait for the new Dave Eggers novel, or Michael Chabon, or a few people, but mostly everything is about getting on the bestseller list or publishing the scores of the box office, and that excitement of an artist's next vision and his next phase is less what it's about. And certainly in the film business, I mean, you don't really rush to see a new film by even some of the great filmmakers that we have, because they have 2 or 3 in so-called development, and the one that gets the actors or the stars, the one that's going to get made. And when you go see the next Ridley Scott film, it's not going to give you some insight necessarily in a profound way about how he feels about life and our times. It's usually that these are products to make a lot of money.
But back to The Godfather, that was not something that when it was brought to you, you necessarily felt, I want to do this.
No, we were broke, and you know, George Lucas would come to me and say, Francis, what are you going to do? Sheriff is going to chain up the door of Zoetrope, and we're not going to be able to get in anymore, and you've got to take. And I read The Godfather. When I read it, I thought of it as a big, like Irving Wallace, you know, if you remember the original book, there was a lot more to it than just the story of the father. It was a preposterous subplot that took up a third of the book about Lucy Mancini and her anatomical problems, and the doctor who cured it and then used it, and it went on and on. So I just thought, oh my God, I don't want to do something like this. But finally I read it, realizing I needed a job. I had also 2 kids and another one on the way. And I started to look at it just more from the story of a father and 3 sons, more classically like a king who had 3 sons, and more like a Shakespeare story. And that's sort of what I excised out of the book. But I didn't want to do it. No.
Did you imagine at the time, as you were making it or afterwards, that it would have the legs it does? Because honestly, you still have people today talk about The Godfather as one of the best films they've ever seen, as if it was just in theater.
Well, you know, ironically, and I think there's some reason for it, the whole time I was making the film, I was very, very much oppressed by the studio. I was always on the verge of getting fired. They didn't like what I was doing. They didn't like the look of the film. They didn't like the casting of the film. And I just thought I was totally washed up. And it was only way later after, and I had shown the film too among friends in San Francisco, theoretically very film savvy people, and no one said, oh wow, that's really something. I said, well, it's long or it's dark. And when, I remember when The French Connections came out, I was almost frightened to go see it. And I remember walking home with an assistant editor who was pushing his bicycle to walk with me, and I said, gee, well, you saw The French Connection? He says, yeah, it's fantastic. I said, well, I said to him, I guess after that, people are going to think The Godfather is just this long, boring, dark movie. And he said, yeah, I guess you're right. so it was pretty low. And
right. What didn't they like about the cast?
Originally?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the studio felt that this newcomer, Al Pacino, was just like, in their words, a short little runt. They thought Brando was clearly washed up, and you know, they just generally, I guess, it was just a different way to make a movie, and that's probably what made it have some life, is that it was not made in the way that they would make a gangster movie, and it had its own style and look. And, you know, I've learned in my life, as a young person, I wrote the script of Patton.
Right.
When I was pretty young, about 25, 26, and when I finished that script, they really took big exception with the beginning and argued with me about how can you have a beginning where this man walks up, a 4-star general with all these decorations, and just gives a speech to the audience, and then the next shot he's a 3-star general, and it's all just doesn't, people will be confused. And of course, the opening of Patton is considered a great opening today. So what I conclude, and what I even tell young people, is remember that the things that you're fired over when you're young are the same things that you're going to be celebrated for when you're older.
Right.
And there's a good reason for that,
right.
because if they break the mold, it's hard for people to grasp something that's a little different than what they're used to.
But is it easier today for a young filmmaker to take that stand than it was back then?
Well, it's so different now. Back then, when we went to film school in the early 60s, none of us thought we'd ever get to make motion pictures. We thought we were going to make industrial films or educational films. Now it's we know here in your own town, we know Robert Rodriguez made a film for $29,000, and the technology has become more accessible, and so we know plenty of young people are making feature films now, which is fabulous. But
maybe they're not as reliant on people to have to give them permission.
Yeah, they get their uncle's credit card or God knows what, but we know it's possible. In those days, it was a real barrier to think, because the directors of films, if you see the stills from the 40s, they're wearing suits and have a pipe, and very often they're it was a club, a very exclusive club. But even so, that young people now can make films, the problems confronting them of getting distribution, because there are so many of them, right. and distribution has always been the key. How do young people, you go to places and they desperately want to give you their DVD, and it used to be their script, now it's their DVD.
There may be a few of them here, actually.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Let me come back to The Godfather. So 2 years later, you make the first one, and then 2 years later, you make the second one. And I wonder what changed.
I didn't want to make the second one at all. I had such a miserable experience on the first one. The thought of being there doing it, and what I finally, after they really said, we'll do anything, please do it, I said, I will agree to produce the second one and help a director do it, and I'll choose the director. And after some months went by, I came to them and said, okay, I'm ready, and I've chosen a director to do the second one, and they said, who? And I said, Martin Scorsese, and the same guys who didn't want Brando and Pacino said, absolutely not, that's ridiculous, And then the head of the company, who was Charlie Bluthorn, said to me, finally, Francis, okay, anything you want, what will you do? And I said, okay. And there was a reason why I said, okay. But ultimately, I said 3 conditions. 1, I want you to pay me $1 million, which sounded good.
Then, right, yeah. A lot of money
And
then.
two, I want no executives who were driving me crazy on the first one to have anything to do with it, even to read the script or know anything about it. And they said, okay. And I want to call it I want to call it The Godfather Part 2. And after a day or something, they came back and said, well, we'll agree to the first two things, but we can't call the film The Godfather Part 2 because everyone will think it's the second half of the same movie they saw.
Right.
I said, no. So I prevailed ultimately. Ironically, when years later I did, much to my, because I was in deep financial jeopardy, when many years later I did Godfather Part 3, I said, I don't want to call it Godfather Part 3, I want to call it The Death of Michael Corleone, because I felt it was a kind of a coda,
Right.
And I didn't have the clout in those days to call the
They didn't
film.
want you to give away the ending.
Well, it wasn't, the irony was it wasn't really the ending.
Of course, right. Did everybody make too much of a big deal over that movie? Because honestly, I like that movie a lot, and I think a lot of people like that movie a lot, and you kind of got beat up for it.
Yeah, but that it's kind of, usually those opinions are led by a certain, bit of journalistic foray that takes that position. But over time, those opinions softened, and people take a different perspective. Although, I still feel that really there only, in a way, should have been one film. I thought the first film was complete.
Enough, right? Yeah.
And I only made the second film because I had always been thinking of making another film, a different film entirely, a personal film, about a man and a son, basically at the same age, to tell a story of a 30-year-old and then tell the story of the 30-year-old who was the son or the father and have a parallel story. And that's ultimately, I finally said, well, I'll just do it and I'll call it The Godfather. Right. And of course they said, well, who could ever play Brando as a 30-year-old? And of course I had had my eye on this actor who I thought could do it, who was Bobby De Niro.
That's right.
Which made it possible, really.
Right. Godfather 4?
The thing of all these things is it's just a money decision. There's no reason. I have a different kind of career now, which is what we should talk about, because I'm bored with talking about The Godfather, as you can imagine.
Oh, sure, I could imagine. I could imagine. So, let's talk about some of the other stuff you're doing. The winery.
Well, I wanted to have a little cottage in the Napa Valley because I used to hear wonderful stories from my father about how his father, my grandpa, had 7 sons, and to Italians, to have a meal without wine is unthought of. So even during Prohibition, they were allowed to make their own wine, which they did in a concrete fermenter in a tenement in Lexington Avenue in Italian Harlem, and they would ship boxcars of grapes from the Napa Valley, probably from Robert Mondavi's father. And I used to hear stories about how the boys, they didn't care about the wine, but they wanted to eat the grapes, and so they would have to carry the crates down and lower them into the cellar. And when the old man wasn't around, they would lower my Uncle Mikey on a crate with a rope to go down and steal the bunches of grapes. And when the old man caught them, they let go of the rope, and he went crashing into the grapes and got a big beating. So I just heard these stories and just thought that was so romantic. And since I was living in San Francisco, I went with my wife to buy a little summer house, hoping we could get one in the wine country. And by accident, really, or Providence, whatever you want to say, I ended up buying, instead of a cottage, what was part of the great legendary Inglenook estate. And we started making wine with my boys, except we were making it out of these prize-winning Rutherford Appalachian grapes. Didn't know anything about that level of wine. I was just trying to, kind of relive what I had thought my family was like. And then there was really a wine boom. Inglenook Estate was the great American wine estate founded in 1880, and just by sheer luck I ended up with part of it, and then I ended up buying all the rest and restored it, and had really the finest premium winery in America. And now we have the Rubicon Estate, which is the old Inglenook Estate, which is an ultra-premium winery, and in Sonoma, a new winery, which is the Francis Coppola. So I took the name Coppola, and we're now the 12th largest wine producer in the country, quite a successful, very successful company, which is also in the food and pasta sauce and Italian food, and also in the resort business. So I quite innocently inherited this enormous or created this company. It has 600 employees and is sufficiently wealthy to enable me to now just make any movie I want to that's a personal film, be my own self-finance here.
Right. And just so you mentioned the hotels, a couple of restaurants that you own as well. You have a magazine.
A literary magazine, All Stories, Zoetrope All Story, a very wonderful literary magazine, and that has been now going for 8 years and breaks even, which is a pretty
remarkable thing.
Yeah, because that means it can survive.
Right. So all these things, in addition to film, it's a pretty full life. It feels like.
Very much so, especially a grandpa, you know.
And that's the most important thing. All right. Well, it's really wonderful to see you. Thank you for sitting down with us. Good luck with all the
pleasure.
movies.
Thank you
Francis
so much.
Ford Coppola. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Funding for Texas Monthly Talks is provided in part by Public Strategies Incorporated, managing campaigns for corporations around the clock, around the world, and J.P. Morgan Chase, the state's largest financial institution, serving large and small businesses, governments, schools, churches, and individual Texans just like you for more than 135 years, and the MFI Foundation, improving the quality of life within our community, and the Matson McHale Foundation, in support of public television, and also by the Alice Clayburgh Reynolds Foundation, proud to be a founding partner of Texas Monthly Talks, and viewers like you. Thank you.